Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second and final panel of the day. This is the past, the present, and future walk into a bar. So we're going to drink a lot of beer, do a lot of arm wrestling. Just kidding. Okay. Just like to start with the territorial acknowledgement. I just want to acknowledge that we, with gratitude, acknowledge the land that we are on today. Unceded territory of the Sinaiaks, Ktunaxa, Silex. I will also add Secwepemc as well. Home to Métis and diverse Indigenous persons. We honor and respect their role as storytellers and knowledge keepers on these lands and waters. So this is our 11th year. If you have a gold pass, you've heard us say this quite a few times, but we're just really happy to be here still in this community, having the chance to bring in writers from all across the country, artists, local artists, to just thinkers, to speak on different topics. So this was my idea, and I basically was just like, I don't know what I want us to do, but I want us to talk about time. Because as an artist, I'm always thinking about time. I'm a writer, and so I'm thinking about how do you wrangle with something as dynamic and messy and complicated as time, and how do you put that into whatever box your art form offers? And so we have a number of different panelists here today who I'll introduce in just a moment. Beforehand, we just want to thank all of our sponsors. We want to thank the Prestige for letting us be here in this beautiful room. Like, look at the lights. These are fancy. It's just such a fancy place. And notably as well, and I think Samara, she's at the back here, but like fancy, look at this book bag. Just everything about this weekend is very fancy. So maybe what I'll do now is I'll just give you an idea of what you can expect from this panel. We're going to be looking at how you represent time as an artist. So are you someone who wants to look more at the past, the present, the future? Do you want to see how you can collapse timelines? Are you someone who tries to expand time? Are you trying to write or create outside of a timeline? And also, how do we as artists change over time? So how does who we are as a person at any given moment in time end up informing what we do with our art? Okay? So I'll start by introducing our panelists. I'll start here with Shaena. Shaena is the author of 4 works of fiction: Petra, Oh My Darling, Radiance, and The Falling Woman. Her work has been nominated for the Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, the Ethel Wilson Award, the Evergreen Award, and the Frank O'Connor Award for the short story. Her recent novel, Petra, was inspired by German activist Petra Kelly, who transformed environmental politics only to find herself caught in a triangle of love, jealousy, and murder. The Boston Review wrote, as a work of historical fiction, Petra brings Kelly to the fore in a way that no biography or work of scholarship yet has. Petra won the 2021 Ethel Wilson Award for Best Work of Fiction in BC and the Yukon, and it was a CBC Best Book of the Year. So happy to have you with us, Shaena. Our next panelist is Angie Abdou, who is the author of 7 books, including short prose, novels, and creative nonfiction. Her first work, The Bone Cage, I saw you had it too, you had a stack of books earlier. Anyways, The Bone Cage was a finalist on CBC's Canada Reads. Angie's first memoir, Home Ice, Reflections of a Reluctant Hockey Mom, hit the Canadian bestseller list and the #1 spot on Amazon Canada's best-selling hockey books. Booklist declared it a first-rate memoir. Angie is an associate professor of creative writing at Athabasca University, and her newest book is This One Wild Life, a mother-daughter wilderness memoir, and she lives in Fernie. So welcome. It's nice to have you here. Next, we have Brian Lai. He was a filmmaker, artist, animator, and arts educator. He holds an MFA in studio art from UBC, a BA from the University of Victoria in film studies and Japanese studies, and a diploma of screen from Sydney Film School. And he was a guest student at a film and TV school of the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague. His films and animations have screened in festivals, galleries, television networks. He's been to Sundance, Melbourne Film Festival, Canal Plus, SBS Television Australia, Images Festival, Toronto, Vancouver International Film Festival, the Museum of Sydney, Center of Contemporary Culture in Barcelona. He's been all around the world doing cool art stuff. He's been the artist in residence with the Vancouver Board of Parks and Rec, Klondike Institute for Arts and Culture, and the Oxygen Arts Centre. Born and raised in Vancouver, he is now grateful to live with his family on the unceded traditional territory of the Sinaiaks here in Nelson. So welcome. Thanks for being here. And here at the end, representing the theater contingent of this discussion, is the one and only Lucas Myers. Is it okay can I call you local funny man?
No.
All right, let's do it again. majestic individual with many interests in life besides theater, Lucas Marks performed in many of the major theaters across Canada, as well as touring internationally. He's created and performed in a number of new plays as a member of the Victoria-based independent theater company Theatre Scam. He studied physical theater and collaborative collaboration with the City Company in New York and Boca del Lupo Theater in Vancouver. What's that? These are all amazing people who have done many projects in life. Okay, I can slow down. Where was I? Can always count on Bonnie to let you know if you're doing something wrong. Okay, 2007, he returned to Nelson to raise a family and form co-pilot theater with a mandate to create work that is accessible, thought-provoking, and highly theatrical. He also performs as a postmodern vaudeville duo with the amazing and impermeable Cremoli brothers. He was named a cultural ambassador for Nelson in 2013. Okay. Now am I talking to you, sir? Excellent. So I have a few different topics that I want us to discuss. I think we'll probably have sort of an orderly fashion where you can each speak to your topic, and then feel free to, get excited and, politely borrow the mic from someone else if you have something that you want to say after they finish saying the thing that they have to say. So what I wanted to do is to start fairly general and just have each person, I've already described what type of artist you are, but if you want to sort of talk a little bit about your art practice and what you think is unique about the way that your particular art form, because you're all doing very different things as artists, what do you think your art form can do in terms of representing time that perhaps other art forms can't do? Or what particular issues do you sometimes come up against in your art, figuring out how to work with time that maybe other art forms don't struggle with? So let's just start with Shaena.
Well, thanks. That's so is this nice and loud? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's just I just think anything to do with time is so fascinating, and it is kind of. I think that it's the warp of fiction. The warp and the woof, and maybe it's the woof, but I actually looked it up. I think the warp are those long strings, and so I think it is the warp of fiction, because you're constantly thinking about time and thinking about how your characters change over time. That's really what you're doing, is looking at how someone starts and how someone finishes, and what they go through in order to tell the story. So I think it's kind of a basic, the most basic kind of primary color in the palettes of all the colors that we're using is just how we work with time. And I think that, I don't want to jump ahead, but I think the past is very important. I think if it arm wrestled with the future and the present, it might win. I'm willing to check it out with the others later, but I think the past is so important because so much of what, if you think about it, really I don't want to say the present is an illusion. The present is all we have, but the past is all we really write about, something has to have happened in order for us to write about it. And even when we write in the present, we're just creating an illusion of the present when it was really the past, and we're just trying to make it seem really present by writing about it in the present. And I think that's probably the same with the future. So I'll start with that.
Shaena and I are going to end up arm wrestling. I already don't agree with her. No, so I'm a fiction writer who's recently done 2 memoirs as well, but normally I write fiction. And I always, when I'm writing, I have a process where I do a lot of free writing. I get up in the morning and I like to just sit down on the page and write whatever comes out. And then I like to go for a run or something and then come back with the more vivid ideas that emerge when I leave my mind alone to work on that material that I put down. But when I write, I always write in the present tense. And when I try to write in a different tense, I have to do that free writing first in the present tense and then go back and change it, whether it's past or future. And I think the reason is twofold. I think I like the feeling of immediacy in a novel when you really immerse somebody in a world, and so that feels fresher and more vivid in present tense, like this is happening right now. At one time a reviewer reviewing my first novel, The Bone Cage, said she writes the whole thing in present tense, what a gimmick. And I'm like, tense is a gimmick? Is it past tense a gimmick? What a weird thing to say. Reviewers can drive you crazy. But the other reason I like present tense is because I am always writing about the present tense. I'm always trying to figure out what life is. I maybe think someone less confused wouldn't have to be a writer, but I'm always sort of baffled by life, by why people do the things they do, why relationships are the way they are, why we treat treat other people the way, why communication is so hard. So when I write, I'm always trying to figure out this world around me. Michael Winter's last book was called The Big Why, and I thought that could be the title of all of my books and sort of my life. I could just get it tattooed on my forehead, like, why? So if I write about the past, I'm really writing to understand the present. If I write about the future, I'm really writing to understand the present. So I would argue that even though Shaena's book, Petra, which is brilliant, and you should all read it, it's about a figure in the past, I would argue that even though she says it's about the past, it's not. She's wrong about her own work. It's about the present. So she's drawn to this figure of Petra Kelly because of the difficult woman she was and the relationship she had to infidelity and all of her affairs and her political stance and being a political leader, about the environment that we're so concerned about now. But I would argue that you're interested in all those issues as they apply to now. And even though you're writing about this past figure, this past, see, I already convinced her. She's no fun to argue with. So I think the present is always about the present, really.
Those are such fighting words, but we're just going to wait.
I will remain neutral for now. Yeah, so hi, I work as a filmmaker and an animator, and I do a lot of education projects with youth, teaching them filmmaking and animation. And my interest in film and time is very much about the process and a lot about the material. I do a lot of work with 16mm film, which I brought in a prop and a strip of 16mm film. And what I love about working with film is this is about 36 frames, which is a second and a half of real time. So film, when you think about time, becomes a tactile medium. So I'm holding a second and a half in my hand, and you can manipulate it, you can cut it up, you can reverse it, you can, speed it up. So I think film, the unique thing about film in relationship to time is it plays with time. A teacher of mine once said, he was a sculptor, he said filmmaking is sculpting time because you have this strip, you take another piece, you put them all together, and then you get a meaning or a message or a feeling, whatever it would be. I do say I am a bit attached to the past because the medium I use is a little bit obsolete and is quite old. I'm quite interested in the early cinema when film cameras first came out and when the act that a camera could record and project and present, even pre-narrative, was like the exciting thing about it. So it was all attached to just the medium itself and what it can do. And I think that influences a lot of what I make, is the process and the tactile nature of the medium. And I like the present because filmmaking with film, it's a very, when you pick your frame, when you go for a walk, you have your film camera, you decide, I'm gonna film that bush and I'm gonna roll the camera on it. It's a very present moment because to get your film back, it could be a couple weeks because you send it to a lab, or you could process it in your homemade darkroom in your bathroom, and it could take a couple days. So there's a delay between the act of recording and the act of seeing. So there's this interesting relationship with time based in the process. So I'm quite excited about the process.
Cool. I was happy when Leesa gave me a call because I never think about this stuff with my shows. I was like, oh, time, okay. Oh, how do I think about time? And it's interesting, I just had a realization just while you were talking. There's kind of two versions of time in theater. One is the time that the show is talking about through the storytelling, and the other is the time of the present of the people watching the show. And I think that's what makes it different. I mean, it's similar to dance. Dance is similar, but dance is different because I don't think time is part of the storytelling of dance, right? But there is the time that is happening in the moment, which I think is also different from film. It's a different interaction. You're just really sitting back and watching, whereas with theater, there's a different level of interaction. And then I thought about how I use time, and it's really dependent on the story and what is required in the story, because you really have to take care of an audience when you're doing a show. So I think about, you're eager for information right off the hop, right? Everyone wants to know what's going on. So I was like, how do I show people what time it is? There's my show Roof, he's cooking dinner. And I didn't think about this beforehand, but I was like, oh, look what I did. I told people when we are, right? Because it's a who, what, where, when, right? That's what the audience wants to know right off. Same with, I think, similar in writing, right? So, and if you leave people hanging for too long, they'll disconnect. So I think it's important it is important to let people know when they are, whether it's nighttime, and we do that with lights, etc. The other thing I realized is when you were talking about past and present, is in some of my shows there's a storytelling aspect where the character will be on stage, be speaking to the audience and talking about an experience they had, and then I will enter into the experience, and all of a sudden you're in the present, and it's like the fourth wall goes up, right? And you're watching this happen right now, and I think that's really fascinating. And I don't know another art form that I guess. Yeah, does that happen? I guess does that happen in books? Yeah, you're narrating something and you go into the scene itself. Yeah. Oh, she wants the mic. You mentioned issues that the art form has that's different from other issues, and this is, I think, shared with film. Is I have an hour and a half, right? It's finite, maybe 2 with an intermission, but that's what I have to tell my story. And I can't be too much shorter, or people are going to be pissed off. They paid $20, right? So I am limited, just like strictly limited, by how much time I have afforded to me to tell the story. So I thought that was an interesting thing
and
too.
it's interesting on that line that a lot of times the best, just on that note about the amount of time and the restrictions, is a lot of the best films made from books are made from short stories. Like you get a short story, like I think of The Bear Went Over the Mountain by Alice Munro, is a short story that was made into a beautiful movie, but it's hard to do a whole novel in a movie. So yeah, we're much less restricted in terms of time.
I was hired a couple of years ago to adapt a young adult thriller to a film, and I mapped the whole book out, all its plot points. There were like hundreds of plot points, and I'm like, how can I put this into 2 hours? And so I just had to cut. So I think you're right with a short story is more adaptable, but yeah.
I'm really, well, you know, in the last session that Tom Wayman and Suzanne Simard and the other wonderful writers were there, they talked about this thing duenda, right? And it was just so interesting. Who was everyone there? Like, I just found that so fascinating, this idea that you connect with the audience in a piece of theater and something kind of darkens, and then there's like this moment where, you know, you're sort of surging. And I just was wondering, I mean, I guess I'm wondering, do you work for that? Is that piece of what you're trying to do? This isn't really about time, it's just more about just the question of, I guess time stops. I guess there's an eternal present when that happens.
Like a flow state.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's the connection with the audience. It's the creation of something that wasn't there before, right? And sometimes it doesn't happen, and sometimes it does. And that's the other reason why that time sense, because every show is going to be different too. Like it's never and that's what's different from film as well. The film is there; it's not going to change. But every audience is different, and you will have that moment happen at different times.
And can you feel it when it's happening?
Kind of blackout often. Well, and it's true. It's the flow state, right? Like you enter into a flow state, and that if you're lucky, you know, and that's what you're going for. And if the audience is there with you, it's way easier, right, to do that. If the audience is resistant, then you're doing a lot of work. And sometimes maybe you don't get it, because maybe the audience is resistant for whatever reason. It's not their night, it's not your night, you know, whatever. But yeah, it's that's what you're going for. So, yeah, fingers crossed, always.
I think another way, I ended up talking about Shaena's books instead of my own when I talked. You're welcome. But I was thinking, another way that maybe we're less restricted as novelists than you guys are is what we can do with time within a piece of work. So I was really thinking about about time when I wrote my last novel, In Case I Go, which is about a little boy who's, he's trying to figure out a way forward from all the horrific mistakes of his grandfather, great-grandfather, things like exploitation of Indigenous peoples and exploitation of the land. So his great-great-grandfather had come to Canada as a Syrian coal miner and worked as a coal miner, but then also had a relationship with an Indigenous woman that went very badly. He didn't treat her well, and so this little boy is now being haunted. It's a ghost story. And so really it's just about the generation, my kids' generation, of how do we find a way forward in this country when such horrible mistakes have been made, and they're going to have to find answers for mistakes that weren't theirs, that were their great-great-grandfathers, but we need to find a way forward. But so it's a ghost story, but I really can collapse time, because this little boy is sometimes himself, and he's sometimes his great-grandfather, and the girl next door is sometimes the girl next door, and sometimes she's the indigenous woman that his grandfather exploited, because it's all a kind of haunting metaphor for the burdens of the past. But I do things with time that sometimes when I was writing, I was like, I don't even know what I'm doing here, but you can really get away with a lot in a novel in terms of timeline. Yeah, really a lot. And sometimes I remember being deep into the work and thinking, oh my goodness, I'm writing a historical novel, and I don't write historical novels, but where did I think the ghosts came from? The ghosts came from the past, and now I gotta write the past, and so then I have to go to research to try to figure out how to fit the timeline in so it made sense with world wars and prohibition and then whatever other things popped into this, history that was so inconvenient for me. But you can do that as a novelist, carry these 3 different timelines in the same moment sometimes, past, present, and future.
You can
Do that too.
you can do that too. Here,
Okay,
give me the
yeah,
thing.
let's
Give me the thing.
I think you can totally do that in the theater as well. Like if you set it up properly. There's a Tom Stoppard play that I'm not going to remember the name of. Yeah, where he has the play happening in, I think, the 17th or 18th century and present. And over the course of the play, they both are happening on stage at the same time. And he works it because he's brilliant, right? But he makes it all work. So yeah, you one character can play the grandfather, one player can, and the kid. As long as you help the audience out and have the transitions and show them, I think you can attain that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Art is so cool.
Oh, yeah.
Brian, what about in filmmaking? Like, we're just thinking about multiple timelines. Like, how do you?
Well, I think film has the power to incorporate the past, the present, and the future quite easily within like a film that you would watch on the screen, because it's just based on the representation of the set and the character design, and you can just cut very simply from one to the other. And all the work to do that is immense, but what the audience sees is seamless.
Right.
So I think film has the ability, with a budget, quite easily to jump back and forth.
We need budgets.
Yeah, right.
All right. Now we're just off script. Somebody said something interesting, and I'm like, oh, let's talk about that. I just have a star that says film and sculpting time. So maybe if we can have some other folks just talk about that, what that feels like in your art form. Do you feel as though you are sculpting time, and how do you do that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's such a beautiful way to describe it, and obviously very different because you literally have time and you're holding up a piece of time. That's such a beautiful thing to be able to do tactilely. But yeah, I feel like I'm sculpting time. I feel like that's what I'm doing. I mean, I think a lot about what is this set in the present, is this set in the past? Those are choices. A lot of times this comes out when I'm mentoring people, and I'll say, why don't you just flip all this into the present? It's going to read a lot better. It's going to read more immediately. We talk about when things are in the distant past, in the, set in the Middle Ages, set in the 17th century. It often reads much more clearly and sort of efficiently if it's set in the present. So I think about those things. And also in short stories, I think about, when something is coming towards the ending. I started to notice that, Alice Munro would often do this thing of, flipping into the future, which is very different than, flipping into now I know, the present. Flipping into the future is it's like a wish or I don't know, it's got something more tentative to the way that she does that. And I started to admire it, so I started to do it in my own short stories, and I noticed that it was working. So I think that that this sort of conscious or somewhat conscious using of time, and of course in fiction, you're constantly figuring out when are you going to summarize something, when are you going to tell it deeply, when are you going to tell it super deeply. When you get really deep, are you going to start making it feel like it's the present, and how are you going to make it feel like the present, and what does the present feel like that's different than something remembered or something that's in the past, or what does it feel like when you're living something so deeply that you enter that kind of Zen-like state where everything is heightened. And I think that's a lot of times what we're trying to do in fiction. We're trying to know those spaces and give them that kind of resonance, and then hold back on other spaces. Because it's, of course, very comforting when you're reading a book to have somebody say, 10 years passed and then blah, blah, blah. Because you go, oh, wow, that person's really in control of their narrative, right? They know when to cut something and also then when to zone in on something. So I would say definitely that's part of what I do, what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna agree with you this time. No more arm wrestling. So my last two books were memoir, Home Ice: Reflections of a Reluctant Hockey Mom, about my experience in youth sports, traveling around with my son as he played hockey as a 9-year-old, and then this One Wild Life with my daughter, also when she was 9, about hiking locally with her while she was having issues with confidence, and how do you teach kids about environmental challenges, and how do you teach kids why it's important to connect with nature and setting goals and outdoors, all that kind of stuff. But I wrote them as that was happening. Both those books, unlike fiction, I sold them before they were written, and then was committed to writing them and was writing the stories as they unfolded. So very, very immediate.
Wow.
For real, yeah. It's bizarre to know these people are reading for a book about stuff that we haven't even lived yet. And so the book, This One Wild Life, in Home Ice, this is going to seem really oddly personal for a second, but the books are oddly personal. In Home Ice, my marriage was in a bad place, and I kind of represent that in the book as part of the story. In This One Wild Life, we come through that, we're strong and united as a family, and I represent that. In October this year, my marriage exploded. It was quite shocking and awful, and Jane was there and there was tequila, but so my marriage exploded, my family broke. So that was in October. In November, I had to go speak about This One Wild Life at the Banff Center of Arts, and I was still shocked and horrible. If anyone's ever got divorced, I had that feeling. That's horrible. And I had to get up and talk, and I thought, I'm gonna feel like such a fraud reading from this book about my beautiful family and all these beautiful stories, and it's like, this no longer exists. And so I just decided to be really honest with them, and I did a slideshow and talked about the book, and then I said, and here's a picture of our last ever family holiday in Tofino surfing, because that's not a thing anymore. And so I felt like, was that whole, because I'm shaping time, and I'm shaping the stories, and I'm picking out what's important along the timeline and ignoring the rest and shaping my story. And then when I get to the end and I'm in a different place than I thought I would be, I look back and I see the other story that I repressed or denied along that timeline, all the bad things that happened, or the indications that my husband wasn't maybe quite who I thought I was, or our marriage wasn't quite what I thought it was. So you always pick and choose, and in the book somewhere I say, anytime you tell a story, you're creating a fiction. You're picking some things and suppressing other things, and really life is a series of standalone moments with no meaning to tie them together until you tie them together with a story. And so that is a way of sculpting time. So yes, I sculpt time to write those memoirs, but you sculpt time every time you create a version of yourself on Facebook or create a photo album too.
Wow.
Oh, you brought up the topic. You didn't have to talk about it because he brought it up. I was just thinking about all my shows and going like, how do I treat time in these shows? And the shows that are a narrative arc, you have to address time. There's shows that I have that are very kind of that time doesn't matter. Like I do a show, Hello Baby, which is just kind of a fun show from the pregnancy from the perspective of a man. It's just kind of goofy and funny, and it's just little bits. But I remembered one show I did, I can't remember what it's called now, hilariously, which takes place in real time. It's about an hour-long show, and ideally it was a site-specific show as well. And it's a session of somebody who works for the government, and these people have come to this work, that's what it's called. These people have come to this session because they have done something bad at work, and basically it's for their parole or what have you. And so there's this person leading it, and there's I think 4 people there, and I just sit in a chair for the whole thing. And it starts with the guy sitting there and introducing himself, and then it literally the show lasts the hour of the session. And that was really interesting to do. And I think it was interesting to experience. And there's no audience participation in it at all. It's all you're just watching this thing happen. And I chose to do that on purpose, because I was like, what would it be like for an audience because I think we expect to be taken in different places and to go to, throughout a story. So it was really interesting for me to, I guess, sculpt time in that way with that show. And then the other thing I just thought of was often, and especially with these frickin' the thrillers, it's this time pressure. There's always this is gonna happen in 5 seconds or blah, blah, and I have none of that shit in any of my shows. Not that it's not just thrillers, but I don't know if that's an easy way out, but I was just thinking about my shows that there isn't this has to happen by this time. It's much more a a device of the storytelling, time. Like, and if time has to pass, it's because the character has changed. And then I also thought about time in the sense of rhythm. In a show, you have to be very aware of action and slower parts. And I'm sure this must be the same in writing in a totally different way. And then, 3/4 of the way through the show, it's got to be kind of mellow, and then you have a big ending. Like, it's very much, it reminds me of a piece of music, right? You have to be aware of that as well, the music of a show. So I'm sure there's a similar thing in writing as well, in terms of stuff, a lot of stuff going on, and then it getting personal, and then it getting big, and I don't know, those are the thoughts about sculpting time.
I had one thought that came up is another type of films that I like to do for an installation is where it's a looping film. So there's infinite start and finish points, and it's just on and on and on. And I find that's really a fun way to play with time, because perhaps the more someone sits there, the more they'll see, or the new things they'll come and get from it. As well as the idea that you could walk into that room when that film is being played, and you'll walk in at one point, you'll walk in at another, and so we'll all have a slightly different perspective
What
based
the beginning
on
is, right.
yeah. Well, so you think of it so it can wrap up, and
Yeah.
it won't necessarily have a beginning or an end.
Right.
And it's a real challenge to film something that does have that kind of seamless nature to it. But it's a really fun way to think of time as something that is a hamster caught in a cage, but there are variations in each loop depending on how you see it or how you view it. There was a post-war artist named Robert Breer, and he was really interested in playing with the medium, and he took a strip maybe that was about 4 seconds long, and every frame was of a different image. So he'd take a chair, water glass, dog barking, so every frame. And when you watch this film on loop, in 1 second you're seeing 24 different images, which is more than our eye can catch. But if you spent enough time with that loop, you would likely eventually see everything. So I think, yeah, the idea of the loop is quite exciting. And
There's a fiction version of that. Is that a strategy anybody uses?
There's a fiction version of that. There's a story called The Continuity of Parks by Julio Cortázar. Has anyone read that? Has anyone been in my classes? Did I assign it to any of you? I think it's second year. You won't read it yet. I'll speak very briefly about it, but it's just this short story about this man who's sitting in his recliner reading a book about a man who's going to murder someone, and slowly the murderer from real life comes up behind the person in the book, and there's this moment where the person who's a character in the novel is actually the person reading the book. It just sort of like collapses the story. This is really, so Continuity of Parks, Julio Cortázar, it's worth reading. It's really cool, and it does that. So, and another thing, just in terms of loops, I don't know, I don't want to take up too much time here, but there was this really interesting art exhibition that was happening when I was doing my master's in Toronto, and it was called The Clock. There was a filmmaker, and I can't remember the name, but they had created a 24-hour clock where they just looped together hundreds. Did you see it?
I saw it in Ottawa.
Oh man!
Yes.
And they looped together like hundreds of thousands of clips from movies in which you could see a clock that had the minute of when things were happening. And so the power plant was open for 24 hours. I think it was just like one weekend they had it open for 24 hours. And so I sat there till like 5 o'clock in the morning. I was so tired. But I wanted to know. I was just like, what happens in those deep, dark hours on this loop that went on and on and on? It was on for a month. You could just go and drop it at any time and watch this masterpiece. It was so cool. So it's just good to know that people are like thinking about time on all those levels and just seeing what can we do here? You know, I love experimenting, and you're all doing it in some way. It's super fascinating. So something just came up. A couple of you mentioned sort of the same thing. This is how, sorry guys, this was not the questions that I sent you, but you seem interested in it. That question of rhythm and beats, and like how much time do you spend on each moment or feeling? You mentioned that, Brian, you mentioned that, Lucas, you're talking about that as well. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to add in on that topic? If not, I can go back to the list.
I've got a question. Okay. So I've been reading Angie's book as I've been hanging around doing the blue pencils, and it's absolutely wonderful. If you haven't read it yet, run and get it. It's but I'm about halfway through, and I'm so interested in what you just said about that you were writing it literally as you were living it, and I just don't feel that I mean, I've only done that a couple of times. When I had breast cancer, I wrote a story that was right on top of the horror of discovering it. and it felt different when I wrote it, but generally I feel like something has to dry for me to write, and I just wanted to hear more. It feels like that when I'm reading it. I think what's one of the reasons it's so thrilling, actually, to read this. It feels like I'm getting a window into your life, but just what was that like, and had you actually really sold it? You'd sold it to a publisher and then you were writing it? Wow, okay. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, so that's a big question. So the Home Ice one is different than the one you're reading. Home Ice, the hockey book, it was really driven by conflict. Like, I was very dissatisfied. I love sports, and it's a huge part of my life. And here my son was in youth hockey, and I was thinking, this is the time of my life, taking my kids to sports, and they're going to find these things that I love. And it was just so, anyone who's been involved in hockey, it's just so negative. Like, parents are so crazy, and coaches are, anyways, it was not what I would hoped it would be. And there was a lot of people who thought their 9-year-olds were going to the NHL, and there was just a lot of very poor behavior. So I was driven by that urge that we have to just sit down and talk about this. And I knew there was all this research going on in the university about best practices in sports, and it wasn't filtering down. So I wanted to tell, here's the day-to-day funny stories about my kids in hockey, but weave in that research and kind of get it into the hands of parents. And so I was driven politically. I wanted to see change in youth sports. So whereas if I'm writing a novel, I'm driven by totally other things, and it's a different speed. With that, I was like driven. But then Home Ice, this One Wild Life, the one that Shaena's reading, when I was writing, I still have a hard time explaining that book to people in a way that sounds interesting. I'm like, oh, it's a book about hiking with my daughter. Really, and what? There doesn't seem like enough there for a book, but I get more emails about this book than any book, just people who are connected with. And I knew when I was writing it, it felt kind of slow and not that interesting, but I had gotten to, and this is one of your questions about getting to different places as an artist, and I was just at a different place. I was writing to try to understand the world right around me and really dig into trying to understand my own life. And I think that connects to other people who are trying to understand these issues between mother-daughter relationships and setting boundaries with work so it doesn't overtake your personal life, and how to connect with the world around you. And other people trying to understand those things will connect to it's a very intimate book to me. Like, I'm talking to myself in that book, so I wasn't driven by big questions. And I did every once in a while, because I knew a publisher was waiting for this, think, is anyone going to even want to read this? It seems so private, and it seemed kind of slow to me. But I was at a stage of my writing career where I thought, I'm writing this for myself and to find answers for myself, and if other people want to read it, that's good, and if not, I guess I don't really care. So it's a very different writing process for you. I'm not sure, does that answer?
I mean, yes, it does. But there's also this sort of sense of, like you said, intimacy. I think it is incredibly intimate. But I guess I'm curious about that thing of when you're right on top of something, what's that like as an artist, like as a creator, to be writing into the very thing you're living, as opposed to getting the distance. That's the part that I was really, that keeps intriguing me. And by the way, it's not slow. It's really.
It's like how great her book is. My book's slow.
Yeah.
No, it is.
Okay, so that's the criticism of present tense sometimes. Actually, I've seen reviewers say present tense is a cheat because you don't have to have that wisdom that comes from retrospection. And so when I'm writing something that actually really is present tense as I'm writing it, do I have any wisdom or retrospection? And I would say in that case, I lived very differently when I was writing those two books, because I was writing those two books. So in a way, I write to pay attention to the world around me, and I see things really more vividly and with more depth and with more profound sight when I'm writing. And so I was living on a heightened mode during those times. So I felt like I did have a kind of wisdom I don't generally have day to day. I had another answer in my head, but it's gone. How do it? What's your?
Well, just that sense of and I'm also a little bit curious about, you had sold it and then we're writing it and then we're living it. Like, that whole piece seems so dangerous.
No wonder my husband left me.
Yeah. It seems dangerous. Like, seems like a high wire act.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. And I don't know if that's the other thing I was going to say. It did feel like a high wire act. And sometimes when horrible things would happen in the hockey world, I'd be like, oh, thank God, because my book was getting boring. And I can write about it. That's not a way to live. I don't recommend it. So I don't know if I could do it again, because I had an idea of doing just one more in this trilogy, because I have the one about being a hockey mom with my son, and the one about being out in wilderness with my daughter. And I wanted to do one more about what it means to be a competitive athlete when you're aging, and who are you competing against when you can't even beat yourself from last year, and is there anything redeeming? You know, people will always say to girls, don't be so competitive, and why are you so competitive? But is there maybe something redemptive to be said about competition? And I had a title and I was going to do it, and I sat down and I had nothing to say. I didn't have that distance, and then someone said to me, a friend who's a writer in Toronto, said it's because it's also a book about swimming your way through your divorce, and you're not ready to talk about that yet. So in that case, I just didn't have the distance, maybe.
Well, this is an interesting topic. That idea of your personal timeline and how that interacts with your art or influences it. I'm just wondering if Lucas or Brian, if you can think of any instances where something that was happening in your personal life ended up sort of forming or shaping or like changing the direction of the art that you were making.
I know, but I can comment about some in another way.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you.
And this has to do with time as well. And one of the first shows I did was called Dress, and I can't do that show now because I am a different person than I was when I wrote it. And we were talking about what we prefer to express, and for me, it's present, always. And that comes from when I worked with Theatre Scam in Victoria. We were all young actors, and they were writing material that was from their own lives. And the people our age were coming to see the shows. And this is theater, right? Like young people don't go see theater. So this was revelatory, I think, for the people coming to see the theater as well, to see their lives reflected on the stage. And so I've just gotten hooked on it from then on. So I always, whenever I'm creating something, it's always about stuff that's happening for me in my life, stuff that's happening in the world, stuff that I pick up. Deck, that was a big upsurge in home improvement was going on, and it's tactical as well, because people will relate to it. So I try and find something that's in the milieu that people will go, oh, I've done that. I can really relate to what that guy's going through, or my buddy just did that. What a hellscape it was, So it's totally tactical in that sense. Hello, baby. Lots of people have had babies, or know people that have had babies. So I try and pick things that the people that come and see it will relate to. I hate Shakespeare. No, I'm kidding. I don't there's no, for me personally as an artist, there's no value. I know there is value, but for me personally, there's no value in representing something that's bygone. I much prefer to be in the present. I can't do that. It doesn't feel comfortable as an artist to do a show that I did 20 years ago. There was something else, but I can't remember what it was. But just in terms of that sense of time, that I'm a different person than I was then, to the point where, maybe I could, maybe a young actor, I could hire a young actor and they could do it and they would have a good time doing it. So it could still live, but I sure as shit can't pull it off. It would feel really weird.
I think, definitely like the personal life often enters the work I do. And I think it's a lot just through parenting as well. I have a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old. And when I started my master's degree, my son was born. Our first child was born. And I found the easiest thing to do was, rather to keep art and parenting separate, was to merge them, which sounds similar to what you've done as well. And I think there's a lot of room for, once you make that decision, it's kind of like a little bit relaxing, because you can dip into what's going on with you and not be trying to look beyond what you're living. And I think it's quite fun as well. Like, I think of a little short video work I made a few years ago. Was our son was quite ornery when we first moved to Nelson, and he really lashed out at one of his grandparents. My parents are here, it's not you two. But, and so I Googled, my 3-year-old hates his grandpa. And as I typed in the H, like, all these other things came up. My 3-year-old has an affection for eating poo, or my 3-year-old H. And then I went through the alphabet. My 3-year-old did A, and then all these amazing things come up, B, all these amazing things come up. And it's like, parents have Googled this. Like, there's just, it's hard to fathom, like, all the different things that came up from A to Z. And so I found that was a nice way, to look at what you're doing and let it surprise you and make art from that.
All right. we've got like 10 minutes left. I feel like we can have one more question and then a couple audience questions. So let's see here. We could probably, I don't know, I'm trying to think here. I skipped some questions. What can I say? A couple things that I'm thinking about, and so I'm just going to throw them out there and you can talk about whatever you want for the next 5 to 7 minutes. Here's some things that I'm interested in from you as artists. I'm thinking about like what it's like to write. You talked about memoir quite a bit, Angie, but Shaena, you didn't really talk about what it's like to represent someone else's past and to work with someone else's timeline. And then Brian, maybe if you wanted to talk about what it meant, how it was, I mean, you were working with a novel, which is sort of like taking someone's timeline and just like melding it into a different art form. Could you talk about that as well?
Sure.
Yeah, so in Petra, I take the life of Petra Kelly, who died in 1992, and I'm fictionalizing her from 1980 to 92. And yeah, it was really tricky. It felt transgressive. I think most fiction does feel transgressive. If you're writing, about your family, you're going to get in trouble, and if you're writing about people far away, in Germany, you're going to get in trouble. So I always felt like someone was going to get me. Finally, I had a draft, but it was boggy and it wasn't working. And I even went to a friend's house and we all toasted the death of my novel and said, yeah, we did. We had glasses of wine and we said, this isn't working. It's too dark and it's too close to, I'm traveling too close to these people. And I felt like I was doing something unethical. So we all toasted it. And I went away and I worked on something else, and my mother had a knee operation. I was in Penticton looking after her, and I had 2 hours in a coffee shop. And this other novel I was working on bogged. And I only had 2 hours, so I thought I had my computer, my laptop, I think I had some time left in the battery, and I called up Petra and I thought, I'll just go check this dead thing out. And I took a look at it, and enough time had passed, I think 6 months had passed, and I went, oh, I can write this. I can write this whole thing, but I'm gonna just have to change everybody's name. So I even changed, Petra's name was Magdalena, but then I changed the general, and I kept that change, and I changed some of the principal secondary characters, and that distance allowed me to write the novel right to the end. And I did, what happened was I was just moving in lightning speed, so I was really, I felt so alive, and I was just crossing out everything. I could just see the novel. I was like, that's dead, that works, that's dead, that works. I went through the whole thing, I finished it in 6 days. Yeah, and then I had a lot of time to work, and then I had to keep working on it, and then I worked on it with my editor, but I mean, I just finished that draft. And then I gave it to my agent, and I gave it to my editor, and it was called Magdalena. And they came back to me and they said, we really think you should call it Petra. It was, you want to honor her, and of course I do want to honor her. I want to honor Petra Kelly, and I'm so glad that, of course, I changed it back to her name. But that was how I was able to finish it.
I remember having a drink with you on Granville Island sometime around the bog, because you were like, I just don't know if this is working.
Yeah.
But it's a horrible sickening
Yeah, well,
feeling.
that might have been a different bog.
Yeah,
There were quite a few.
You've had more than one bog. I just want to say on the question of writing someone else's storyline that I had a lot of ethical conversations with myself, struggles about writing about my kids and putting their lives out there, because I was like, what right do I have to put their lives out there, and are they going to be mad when they're older? Are they going to get to be teenagers and say, Mom, how on earth could you have done this? And then one of my friends said, they're going to be mad at you when they're a teenager anyway. Give them a reason. But my agent's Samantha Haywood, and her mother was a writer, Susan Swan. So she kind of gave me some guidelines. She said, like, this is, that's over the line, this isn't over the line, because as growing up with someone who was written about by her mother. But basically I came down to, like, everything I wrote about them, I wrote with such love, from such a place of love, that I thought, how far wrong could I go? But in the end, I was still back and forth about panicking. So when I wrote something about my son, his name on his jersey, I put down that his name was Ollie Abdou, which is not. He has his father's last name, not my last name. And so I said to him, I put that in there just as a way of showing that this isn't really you. This is a version of you for the purposes of my book. And he's just this little kid. I'm giving him this long rambling narrative theory lecture. And he looks at me, he's like, Mom, if you're going to write about me, at least use my name. So I just thought, you can't win. But he's 15 now, and maybe 2 years ago, I found he had grabbed a copy and taken it into his room and read the book about him, and he just was excited to talk about it, and talk about my ideas of hockey versus his ideas of hockey, and he had no problem whatsoever. And same my daughter, when This One Wild Life came out, her picture was in a lot of papers, and she really liked that. She liked the attention. That said, I don't think I would write about them as teenagers. I feel like now they're little adults, and that's if they want to write about their life, they can write about their life. So it feels like something has changed between them being little and being now, but it is something you always have to think about as a writer. Whose story is it, whose timeline is it, and what right do you have? So.
Yeah, totally. I think in relation to documentary film, this is super relevant. And I do lots of projects with youth, and we do documentary films, and what I've learned, and I think is really important, is when it's someone else that's in the movie, is to make sure they consent to the final product is like a thing that I kind of go by now. So when we do projects, or seniors, for example, we did a project in Winlaw Elementary School where they looked at a history of discrimination in the Silicon Valley, and they interviewed a Japanese-Canadian man who was born in an intern camp. They interviewed Marilyn James, the Senex matriarch, and they interviewed two Doukhobor elders, and looked at issues that had happened to those three groups. And the students interviewed those folks, and then they made their films, and we made a point of showing those folks the films before they were released to make sure this is how you're being represented. Are you okay with this? So yeah, I think with someone else's story, it's interesting. I wonder the differences between writing and film, but I think that's a critical piece now, because documentary film has this horrible history of misrepresenting, and there's such a power that a filmmaker holds and an editor holds in telling someone else's story, and they can totally botch it, and people can be upset about that. So yeah, I think consent-based filmmaking in documentaries is important to me. And yeah, and in respect to the novel, to the screenplay, that was working with someone else's words as well. And that one's interesting because I didn't love the novel that I was given, and I was hired to do it.
Yeah.
And
how do you deal with that? You're like, oh shit.
it was a teen thriller, and it had lots of sexism in it, and it had lots of things that I wasn't really that keen on.
Mm-hmm.
And as well,
You don't like sexism? Anti-sexism.
And it was all and so I guess I just did my best to make it good, and but that's very personal lens. It's very subjective. But I think the challenge, as I mentioned quickly, was just the scale of a novel that had hundreds of plot points. It was a thriller as well, so you had to go from here to there and make sure this. And so by taking one character out, suddenly a whole bunch of other things didn't make sense anymore. So yeah, I had all these sticky notes and mapped out the whole thing, and then just figured out the easiest way to strip it down and still have it the thriller element, but make it viewable in 2 hours. And there was so much dialogue in it as well, which is a big difference between, I think, film and writing, is because in film tradition you try and show and not tell, and so just to cut down huge descriptive scenes of dialogue that kind of inform everything, how to rearrange that through the camera was a big challenge also.
Yeah, no doubt. Lucas, did you want to have final thoughts before
Sure.
we questions?
That funny thing about, I think you and I were talking about this last night a bit too, Leesa, that people will also just assume, like in Hello Baby, I have one bit about mother-in-laws, which is absurd. Like, it's ridiculously goofy. And I had people going up to my mother-in-law and being, "Oh, he really went after you in that show." And that's not, like, so people all kind of assume biography, or they assume, like, if I have teens in my show, the character is not me by any stretch, but people assume that I'm reflecting my teens in the show, and I'm completely not. So I think there's an interesting thing in terms of being ethical and all, and it's like, at a certain point you're like, fuck it, I just gotta do it, I'm just gonna do the show, and people are gonna think what they think. And I also have to come clean. I totally have to come clean. When I talked about doing a show that had no of that time pressure, I did a show called Campground, that Darren helped me out with a ton, and I built it as a mystery to some extent, kind of a missing persons thing, and there is the main character does feel a time pressure to find this person who's gone missing. So I completely lied. I'm sorry. I was like, oh no, I totally did that, and used it as a not as a storytelling device to put pressure on the story and to create tension. So my apologies.
Great. We just have a few minutes. Anybody have any questions? You have some awesome people up here. I'm gonna get Brian first, and then Kathleen, and then Bonnie. So you can ask it from there. Or
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So there's this idea in physics that time and space are kind of relative to different things like velocity and different physical laws and things. And when I think about that idea of time being relative with regards to art, I think more down the line of mood or emotional state and how that affects our experience of time. And lately I've been reading Cormac McCarthy a lot. He does this thing where he'll just tell you something that's going to happen, like 2 or 3 chapters before it happens. And it does, you don't have all the context, so it's kind of vague, but you know this thing is going to happen. Like he'll say, this was the last time he ever saw her, or something. No, it could be better than that, but something like that. And what it does for me is it creates this kind of sense of doom, like, oh, something is going to happen, and then I'm racing towards that conclusion. So it affects my own perception of time. So I guess my question is, would any of you like to speak to the ways in which either a character's emotional state or the evocation of an emotional state in the reader affects our perception of time?
The thing I love about that, the thing I love about what you just said about Cormac McCarthy is it just goes, as a writing teacher, we might say, you can't do that, like show, don't tell, and you can't do all the, but the thing is, if you're a good writer, you can do whatever you want, right? But that doesn't make for very good lessons. Welcome to my class. If you're good enough, you can do whatever you want, right? Now I'm done teaching you. But that just goes to show, that's so interesting. And also in relation to time being relative to emotional states, I think we all have a great example of that with COVID. Time is so weird, but I can't remember anymore if something was 4 years ago or 1 year ago, and my timeline's all messed up because of how this last couple of years has been messed up.
Yeah.
And one more thing I want to say that you made me think of is just a really popular book, The Time Traveler's Way. So the couple keeps meeting up at different stages, they're different ages every time they meet because he's a time traveler. So they each know different things about their relationship depending on what age they are when they connect. And then so the other one has to fill the other one in about what their relationship is because they have different memories and they're at different points on the timeline. And it's so interesting. I think that's what relationships are based on shared memory often. And when you take away the shared memory and the shared timeline, you don't have that relationship anymore. So that's kind of just something that popped into my mind when you were talking.
All right, anybody else want to?
It just made me think about moments in a play when it feels like time slows down. And I've had this experience performing. And it's that thing where there's a lot going on, then all of a sudden it gets very small and very close and very still. And that feels like things, like it is playing with, what is the word? I guess rhythm or like the speed of things, and yeah, you kind of, and bringing everybody along and like a galloping horse. And then you go to a canter, and then you actually go to stillness. So that feels like tempo, that's the word. Feels like you're messing with the tempo, right? And that sense of time, I think is really interesting. And then it gets really still, and then you can go from there, you can go anywhere, right? If everyone goes with you, and hopefully they do. But that's what, that made me think of that.
And often in what pulls people along in fiction is unanswered questions. So traditional wisdom will say, well, don't tell them that she's going to die because then they don't have the question anymore. But you still have the question of how did she die? So it's still an unanswered question pulling you along, but it's done in an unusual way. So cool.
Thank you.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I can't figure out if I'm going to ask exactly the same question. Because mine was about the audience perception of time, in the sense that you already touched on, like, for example, the flow state, which is the ultimate being present, like time ceases to exist. You talked about your novel taking you 6 days to write after you were in a great state doing it. And sometimes when you watch a movie or something, or you're reading a book, like you'll look up and it's 2 a.m. and you're like, holy shit, I've been reading this book forever. And like, I think that's what you want. Like, you want the person to be like, it's like a good party. Like, you don't want your party too long, you want it to be perfect. But then there's other moments where you want someone to feel time, like that it's excruciating. And so how much do you take into your audience when you're writing, and how you want them to feel time? That's my question. Yeah. But I don't know if it's the same question.
Anybody else? Angie?
I did think for a second.
It's such a good question, but I don't have an answer.
I always think about my audience. Like, that's, and some people don't. Some people that write shows say, this is what I want to say, take it or leave it, this is what I'm creating. But I, just as an artist, I'm always very conscious of and I also know I'm creating shows that I want to tour in the interior of BC. So I can't do a 6-hour version of Hedda Gabler, right? As awesome as that would be. A one-man 6-hour Hedda Gabler. Here it comes. I'm aware of that. And I don't mind having that limitation, because I think it's important to have limitations when you create. You got to, otherwise it's like, what do you do? But in terms of putting them, I guess it's the same, kind of the same answer in terms of tempo, right? Like, there's those moments when you want them on the edge of their seat, and there's the moments when you want them back in their seat laughing, or do you know what I mean? It's the music of it, I guess. Yeah.
I think it's depending on the avenue or the audience, the venue, that time considerations for an audience are very different. In a cinema, they're there for an hour and a half, and they're kind of stuck as well, right? Like, people can leave, but it's much easier to leave a gallery. Like, if there's a film playing in a gallery, you can kind of wander through and like, oh, this isn't for me, and you're gone. So I think with a cinema audience, you have a little bit more play to like stretch things out a little bit. I often I get quite indulgent with like a shot or a frame or a film, and that's sort of, if I wanted to film this glass, I was like, man, this glass, and it looks really good on film. That would be like the gallery piece, right? So I think with time in the cinema, a little bit more thought for the audience is required, and I think in the gallery you can be a bit more indulgent. I think there's like a difference between the two.
I think what you're talking about, for me in fiction, is something that I would do in revision, not in a first draft. So I do it sort of intuitively, that the time flows along the way I want it to in a scene, whether it's supposed to scene's supposed to occur in an hour, or days, or minutes. You kind of get that intuitively. But then on revision, when I go back, I would notice if it's not working. I'd be, this is unfolded too fast. The reader doesn't have the sense. It doesn't feel real. It's going to pull them out of the fiction because it doesn't feel like that could have happened as fastly as it happened. I need to move in a passing of time, some things to show time passing, or vice versa, it's dragging out too long, and then you're like Shaena with her axe cutting out, as you talked about, just like, no, it's too. And I find I have no problems cutting my writing anymore. When I first started writing, I liked the drafting and I hated revision. It was torture, and now I find the other way, that when I'm drafting something, I know how rough it is, and I know how much better it's going to be through all those drafts. So I like when I get to the point of making it better, and I'm not precious at all about cutting things. Now, if a chapter is dragging, I'll cut a whole chapter and not think twice. So yeah, but that's something that making the time kind of feel for the reader that it's passing at the right rate is something I would look at revision when it jumps out as wrong.
Okay, and then Bonnie, you're our last question. Oh, are we out? I'm sorry, Bonnie. We're out of time, but you can just come up afterwards. So Robin gave me the cutoff. I'm really sorry. I gotta do my closing remarks. Okay. No, we have people wanting to hear Bonnie, so we're making executive decision.
Thank you, Bonnie. One is Kate Atkinson wrote this book, Life After Life.
Well, that's like the loop.
Yes, that's the loop that she does. And my question is, I saw the Cremoli brothers 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And you're still doing it.
Yeah.
Is it different?
No. Some of it is, but some of it isn't. Cromwell Brothers is my music, is my album. So it's my, the Beatles can play, well, they can't obviously now, but they could play the White Album. And so that's, like, I love going back to the material, and it's the only material I have that I feel like people can come and watch, and it will be slightly different every time. The way the show works is the audience chooses the order of the show. So every show is completely different in terms of its rhythm and in terms of where it goes. So that's why I feel okay about doing that, and I like revisiting it, and there's a lot of music in the show. There's a lot of songs in the show, so yeah.
We had time for that. Okay. Thanks all of you for spending the first nice Saturday in the history of this year here inside with us. So we want to thank our sponsors who make the festival possible. So thanks to the City of Nelson, the BC Arts Council, BC Gaming, the RDCK, Columbia Basin, SFU, our very best friends notably, yes, in 2 places, and Nelson Kootenay Lake Tourism and the Nelson Star. They're amazing. We love this venue, this fancy venue, the public library, Nelson United Church as well. We had some sessions there. Volunteers, you're awesome. We love you. Community, you're here. We love you. Thank you for always being here for us. The next thing on the agenda today is at 4:30, just out on the lounge. So hey, sunny day. Looking for something to do? The workshop participants who worked with Magpie on performance, and I don't know if the podcast folks are doing things too, or
who's to say who will show up or what they will do?
We don't know.
We will be there and we will
If you are in for surprises, people making art out on the patio in the sun sounds pretty good, and then we'll see you back here tonight if you have tickets for the all-star reading with Angie and Shaena and Tom, who's here in the audience, and Suzanne. It's sold out, so I hope you had your tickets ahead of time. Thank you so much. We'll see you later.